What we've been doing each night this week is we're looking at a set of big questions that everybody has to have working answers for in order to live. So questions like, what are we human beings? And what's wrong with us? And what, if anything, could improve us? And what would put us right? Luc Ferry, who's done a book called A Brief History of Thought, it's got an English translation, so I'm able to read it now. And he mentions the fact that most of us have these working ideas. You might say a sort of a working philosophy of life, but he says we have a tendency to be optimistic about how original we are. He says basically there's been 4, 5, or maybe 6 systems of thought in history from which almost all of our basic ideas of how to live come. Christianity is one of them, and therefore if we're going to live a thoughtful life, we need to know something about Christianity's answers to those questions. So that's what we're doing, and we're looking at some of this every night. Many people say, well, I live in Britain or some other part of the West, so I know all about Christianity. We don't know as much as we think, and that's one of the things I'm trying to show you in these evenings. We're looking at the Gospel of John. It's a New Testament book, a book in the New Testament. It's there on your seat. And each night we're looking at something, some individual or individuals that Jesus has an encounter with, and we're answering those questions. Tonight we're looking at what will put us right. What did Jesus come to do? See, the answer to who we are, what is wrong with us, who can put us right, and what has he done to put us right? We're going through the Christian answers to the big philosophical questions. We now come tonight to ask the question, what has Jesus come to do? And how will that put us right? Now, I'd like to read you an incident. It's on page 7. It starts at the top. It's only about 11 verses long. The little superscripts, the little numbers between the sentences are verse marks, versifications. It's a way of measuring where we are in the text. It's about a wedding feast. A wedding feast was a very, very big deal in ancient times. It was the biggest event of your life, your wedding. But there's a great disaster here socially. They run out of wine in the middle of the feast. The feast always lasted for a number of days. And that's what this incident is about. So at the top of page 7, I read this. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 80 to 120 liters. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, the key to understanding this event is at the very end, verse 11, where this is not just called a miracle, though of course it was. It's called a sign. A sign, a symbol, a signifier. A sign is a signifier of something else. This is the beginning of Jesus' career, the beginning of his public ministry. And when you are, let's just say you're a candidate for office or a business person and you're launching a brand or you're launching a campaign hoping that you'll be elected, the very first presentation is going to be carefully controlled so that every single thing you say, everything about the environment, everything is getting across what you're about. You want everything to be conveying the message or what you're all about. Look at this. Nobody's dying. Nobody's demon-possessed. Nobody's sick. See? Nobody's starving. And yet this is Jesus' first miracle. Why would Jesus decide that the quintessential signifier of what he's all about would be to keep a party going? To bring in great wine, by the way, notice, great wine, to keep a party going. Why in the world would he do that? Reynolds Price, who was a very prominent professor of English literature at Duke University for many years, wrote a book in which he analyzed 3 of the Gospels literarily. He looked at, he actually looked at Mark, John, and then he wrote his own version. It's a very interesting book. It's called 3 Gospels. But when he was, just as an expert in literature, reading through the Gospel of John, he said something remarkable about this. Basically, he says, this is not fiction. And he says, quote, if you were inventing a biography of Jesus Christ, who would invent for his inaugural sign of Jesus' career a miraculous solution to a mere social embarrassment? Or put it this way, Jesus Christ uses all of his almighty power to wipe egg off the faces of 2 befuddled teenagers, because the bridegroom and the bride would have been teenagers. Why in the world would this be the inaugural sign? And who would have thought it up? And Reynolds Price makes the case, it's a sign of it being an eyewitness account, that this really happened. You wouldn't make something like this up. Now, I'm going to show you in a second that Price is actually exaggerating a little bit. This is more than a social embarrassment. But do you see the question? We need to understand all of this passage as a symbol of what Jesus was about. What did he come to bring? Why did he have to bring it? And how does he bring it? What did he come to bring? Why did he come to bring it? And how does he bring it? First, what did he come to bring? The master of the banquet, see in verse 8 and 9, master of the banquet, it's a hard word to translate. It's a single Greek word. We would translate it master of ceremonies, MC, presider. He was really a person who, it was his job to make the party great. And when Jesus turns water into wine and saves the day, you know what Jesus is saying? Let's get right to the point here. Jesus is saying, I'm the true master of the banquet. I am Lord of the feast. I come to bring festival joy. Yes, I'm going to suffer. Yes, there's going to be self-denial. Yes, there's going to be a sacrifice, and my followers will have self-denial and suffering and sacrifice. But those are means to an end. This is the end. I come to bring festival joy. That's why this is my first sign. Let's not forget that. Jesus is saying, you know all those Dionysian kinds of myths and legends about the forests running with and flowing with wine and dancing and music? Kid stuff compared to what I'm going to do. That's what he's saying. Now, why does the Bible so often use sensory language? Psalm 34 says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Well, don't they already know that the Lord is good? I mean, the psalmist is writing to believers, Israelites. Certainly they know the Lord is good. He says, of course I know that you know the Lord is good. I want you to taste it. What does that mean? I want you to experience it. Some of you know, some of you don't, but I'll tell all of you, that I'm a Presbyterian minister, and for a Presbyterian minister to be up here saying that Jesus Christ comes to bring joy. Joy not only in the future, ultimate joy, but actual experience of joy, deep heart fulfillment right now. It's weird for me to be saying that, but the Bible forces me to do it. Do you know what the Bible says about the last day? What's going to happen at the end of time? I think Jesus he's thinking about this. Isaiah 25, at the end of time, in that day, the Lord of hosts will make for his people a feast of the finest meats and well refined, and on this mountain he will swallow up death forever. And the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces, and your reproach and shame will be taken away forever, for the Lord God has spoken. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, when Samwise Gamgee wakes up, having been rescued from the fires of Mount Doom, and he wakes up and he sees Gandalf still alive, and he realizes what's happened. And he says, Gandalf, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Sweet, huh? But Jesus, the Bible, the New Testament, says that that's ultimately what he's going to do. He's going to bring us to a place where every tear is wiped away, where there's a new heavens and new earth, that this world, we're not just being taken out of this world into heaven, but heaven is going to come down at the end of time to renew this world, that everything sad is going to come untrue. That's what he ultimately is here to do. That's what he came to do. In the Brothers Karamazov, at one place where they're talking about suffering, there's this absolutely remarkable passage. And I think it's Ivan Karamazov who's saying this, but it really doesn't matter because it's so astonishing. And it's talking about, well, is there anything that's going to ever make suffering, make sense of suffering? And here's what he says. I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, of the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, of all the blood that they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. That's Dostoevsky's Christianity coming through. But he says, I believe at the end there is going to be something so astonishing, so the joy will be so incredible, the fulfillment will be so amazing, that all of the suffering of history will look like a couple of bad nights. Or on the other hand, if you want, you could actually think about joy now. It's intermittent. It's nothing like the joy in the future. But there was a Baptist preacher in London in the middle of the 19th century named Charles Spurgeon. Baptists are a little more likely to talk like this than Presbyterians, but not a whole lot. And yet, because this is what he experienced. At one place he said, some of us know what it is like to be too happy to live. The love of God has been so overpoweringly been experienced by us, talking about himself, on some occasions, that we almost had to ask God to stop the delight, for we could endure it no more. If God had not veiled his love and glory a bit more, we would have died for joy. I don't want to give anybody the impression that that's the normal experience of a Christian in prayer. But the fact of the matter is it's possible. The fact of the matter is, to some degree, it's inevitable. Jesus Christ says, I am Lord of the feast. In the end, I come to bring joy. That's the reason why my calling card, my first miracle, is to set everyone laughing. Secondly, that's what he came to bring. Why did he have to bring it? Now, when Jesus starts to do his miracle, he very deliberately chooses vessels in which he's going to do his miracle. He's going to rescue these young teenagers from their problem. And how does he do it? He does it, as you can see, by filling up jars used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. Now, we'll get back to this, but here's what you have to keep in mind. Judaism, the Old Testament, had this great set of rites and regulations. And those rites and regulations all got across the idea that God is holy and that we are flawed. There's something wrong with us spiritually. And therefore, we need to be purified. We need to be cleansed. Our sin needs to be atoned for. So there's the purification rites. There were the clean laws. Above all, there were the sacrifices, blood sacrifices. And we'll get back to all that in a minute. But the whole idea was the Old Testament always said, because God is holy and righteous, and because we are flawed, we cannot just walk right in. Something has to be done about what's wrong with us. And by the way, in this case, we got to keep this in mind. These teenagers, here's where Reynolds Price is probably wrong. When he says this is a mere social embarrassment, we're forgetting we in the West do not live in a shame and honor culture. Some of you, because I know I've spoken to some of you after these meetings here tonight, some of you have grown up in shame and honor cultures, non-Western cultures. You know how deep the shame can be if you've let your family down, if you've brought embarrassment to your family. It's not something we in the individualistic West understand very well. But these young people actually had a very serious problem. A very serious problem. And they had shame. They had guilt, or at least it was coming. And Jesus Christ rescues them from that, redeems them from that, by showing us that he is going to cleanse them, you see. He's replacing the old idea that we have to use water, we have to eat certain things, we have to sacrifice animals. He's actually hinting that he's coming to do what all of those regulations used to signify. Now, what we are at, and I'm only going to take another couple minutes on this, two nights ago, we talked about this whole idea of sin. I know that the term sin grates on us, but we can't understand the joy Jesus is going to bring unless we understand sin. Unless you understand that there is actually, according to the Bible, we're stained, we need to be purified, we've got guilt and shame that we need to be rescued from. Now, I know people just really, really squirm when I talk about this, so let me be pretty direct. You actually do know, I believe, all of you, take my life in my hands here, that something is really wrong. Why are you working so hard? Why are you working so hard? Why is it so important to look good? Why do you worry so much about how you look? Why do you, not only physically, but why is it so important to achieve? You know, I believe, there's something wrong, and you're trying to purify yourself. You're trying to cover up. You're trying to deal with it. You're trying to prove yourself. You know, the first, and I think I'm safe to say you've probably seen this. You remember the first Rocky film, the only good one? Where he's in bed with Adrian, and she's, talking to him, and suddenly he says, I don't really even want to win the fight. I just want to go the distance. And she says, why? She says, if I just go the distance, he says, then I'll know I'm not a bum. Now, that's a Philadelphia American phrase, but I would love for you to at least ponder this, that one of the reasons why you're so excited that you got into Oxford, and one of the reasons why you really have all these dreams and you're working so hard to look good and to do well and achieve, is because you're trying to prove to yourself and everybody else that you're not a bum. Remember Harold Abrams? What was driving him to be, in Chariots of Fire it's depicted, what was driving him to be this sprinter, to do back then the 100-yard dash, okay? And at one point he says, when the gun goes off, I've got 10 seconds to justify my existence. And he's just being candid about something that a lot of us don't want to be candid about. We don't just want to do well. We don't want to just make a contribution to society. We don't want to just make our mark. Deep down inside, we feel there's something wrong. And we've got to prove that we're right. We fear that we're a bum. We fear that we're stained. We feel there's something wrong, and we've got to prove to other people that we're okay. Another way to put it, if you want to get biblical and go back to Genesis 3, where it talks about Adam and Eve, the human race, turning away from God and immediately feeling naked and feeling they had to cover up, and they couldn't let people on the outside see what they were like, so they put fig leaves on themselves. Consider the possibility that your Oxford education is a fig leaf, a big fig leaf. And I want you to consider the fact that afterwards, it won't be enough. It will never be enough. Please think about that. One more thing about this before getting on, where we have to go. Jesus Christ came to bring joy. He had to come to bring it because deep inside, we don't have that. We know there's something wrong with us. We know we need to be purified. We know we need to be washed. Even those of us who actually don't even love the idea of sin. But I want you to consider there's more depths of self-centeredness and sin in you than you want to believe. I'm concerned for almost any young person I see. I'm concerned. There's stuff in you that you would like to deny, theologically, philosophically. You're a humanist. You don't believe that human beings are innately evil or anything like that. I'm very concerned. There's stuff in your heart that will bite you. It will spring out in the future. And you'll say, I didn't know I was capable of that. But you are. Years ago, 1961, Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the Nazi architects of the Holocaust, who got away after World War II and went to South America, was caught. And he was arrested and he was taken back to Israel for a trial, 1961. And he was tried and found guilty and executed. But there was a very interesting incident that happened. What they had to do, of course, as you may know, is they had to find witnesses, people who saw him do it, who were in the death camps and saw what happened in the death camps. They had to come in and be witnesses, material witnesses. One of them was a man named Yehiel Denor. And when he came in and testified, he walked into the room, the courtroom. He saw Eichmann in the glass booth, and he immediately broke down, fell to the ground, sobbing, crying out. It was pandemonium. The judge was hammering to get order. It was very, very dramatic. Sometime later, Yehiel Denor was being interviewed by Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, which is a TV magazine news show in America. And Mike Wallace asked Yehiel Denor, he showed him the tape of himself falling down, and said, why did it happen? What was upsetting you at the time? And then he asked him these questions. Were you overcome with hatred? Is that why you collapsed? Was it post-traumatic stress syndrome? And Denor said, oh, no. And then he said something that absolutely shocked Mike Wallace and should shock almost all secular Western people. He said, no. When I walked in and saw him, I suddenly realized he was no demon or Superman. He was an ordinary human being exactly like me. And I suddenly became terrified about myself. I saw that I am capable of the very same things. Look, you can either say the Nazis were subhumans, not like us. We could never do anything like that. And of course, don't you remember, that's how they became Nazis, by thinking certain people were subhumans. Or you can say, I'm the same. There must be stuff down there in me, if I'm capable of that, and I am. There must be stuff down in me I don't want to see. And there is. You need to be cleansed from it. You need to be purified from it. Point 3. How did he come to do it? Now we get into the narrative heart of the passage. Did you not notice, you probably noticed what looked like an emotional non sequitur, and you probably didn't notice an additional, how do I say it, logical non sequitur. Mary comes up to Jesus and said, it's been a disaster. They're out of wine. Verse 4, woman, why do you involve me? That's pretty cold. Did you notice it? Sometimes you wonder a bit about the translation. Maybe that's just the way the translation comes out. No, the translators will tell you this is an unusually cold way for Jesus to be addressing his mother, especially in that kind of society, that family-oriented society. Something's bothering him. He's pressed. He's under pressure. He's stressed. And then he says, my hour has not yet come. Now, if you would read the whole book of John, and I would love it if you did, and you're a very, very careful reader, you will find out that every place Jesus speaks about his hour, he's talking about his death, the hour of his death. John chapter 7, John chapter 8, John chapter 13, on and on, it talks about my hour, and we'll get there. It's the hour of his death. Now do you see the non sequitur? She comes up and says, what a disaster. They've run out of wine. And Jesus says, woman, why are you telling me this? I'm not ready to die. It's possible, by the way, that Mary knew, maybe not exactly who Jesus was, but that he wasn't normal. Because if you notice, she goes to the servants and says, whatever he does, tell you, do it. She doesn't get upset with him. She doesn't go nuts. I have no idea what's going on in her mind, but I do know this. He is saying, oh, really? You want me to do something about their shame? You want me to bring joy to them. See, this is a sign. It's all a symbol. And therefore, I believe, I know pretty much, if you study this text, Jesus is looking past his mom. And he's looking past the bridegroom and the bride. He's looking past the wedding party. And he's looking at something else. And he's saying, I have come to deal with their shame. I have come to bring joy. But I'm going to have to die to do it. And I actually think there's something else happening in his mind. And by the way, I do believe that John means us to think about this. Just maybe, he's even thinking of something else. In the Old Testament, the point is this is a wedding feast. The first miracle, the first sign is a wedding feast. In the Old Testament, God depicts himself as the bridegroom of his people, which shows that God in the Bible doesn't just want a relationship with us as kings to subjects. He wants a love relationship to us, to you, as profound as the love relationship between a husband and a wife. So he calls himself the bridegroom in the Old Testament. Jesus comes along, and in this gospel and in the other gospels, he says things like this. At one point, his disciples are being criticized for not fasting, and he says, why should the friends of the bridegroom fast when the bridegroom is still with them? And I won't get into what he's talking about there, but here's the point. He calls himself the bridegroom. The bridegroom, fully knowing who that is according to the Bible. And John, the gospel writer, understands this theme, because if you get to the end of the New Testament, to the book of Revelation written by the gospel, by John, he depicts the end of all things, the same way actually as Isaiah 25. He depicts the end of all things as what? This is what it says at the end. Then I saw the holy city, Jerusalem, come out of heaven, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a voice saying, blessed are those invited to the wedding feast of the Lamb. In other words, at the end of time, there is going to be a feast. But it's not just going to be a general feast, it's going to be a wedding feast. Because all the things that Jesus Christ has sought to accomplish, all the things he came to accomplish, will be accomplished. And therefore, maybe what John wants us to think about is this. Kathy, actually, my wife Kathy brought this up years ago. She said maybe the reason why Jesus is sort of grumpy with his mother is he's thinking of something else. And I told you what I'm pretty sure he's thinking about. But here's another possibility. What do single people think about at weddings? Why do sometimes single people sit at wedding receptions with this kind of funny, faraway look in their eyes? They're thinking about what their wedding day might be like, and maybe Jesus is thinking, just maybe, he's saying, Mother, for my people to fall into my arms, and for us to drink of the rivers of God's delight, I'm going to have to die. For my people to drink the cup of joy and festival blessing, I'm going to have to drink the cup of justice and of punishment and of death. Do you see? Jesus is always thinking about his death. Many people say, who cares about doctrine? Don't worry about the church. In fact, much of Christianity I reject, but I like Jesus. I think if people just imitated the life of Jesus, if that's the important thing. Look at how he loves people. Look at how he gives to people. He cares for the poor. He feeds people. If you just forget about everything else, just imitate his life, that's what you should do. I've heard many people say to me that. That is absolutely wrong. Because Jesus did not come primarily to live. He came primarily to die. We saw last night everything. When he's raising Lazarus, he's thinking about his own death. When he's at a wedding feast, he's thinking about his own death. Mark chapter 8, I'm going to have to die. The disciples don't understand what he means. Mark chapter 9, by the way, everybody, I'm going to die. They don't understand. Mark 10, by the way, guys, I'm going to die. The disciples were focused on his life. They felt like, here's a Messiah. He's going to get on a horse. He's going to throw off the boot of the Roman oppressors. Great. As long as they were focused only on his life and thinking, I'm just going to follow him in his life. I'm going to be like Jesus. Go read the Gospels. You'll see the apostles were fools. They were always acting in foolish ways. They were always clueless. It wasn't until he died and after his death and his resurrection, which we'll talk about tomorrow night, that changed them completely. Why? Here's the thing you need to see. If Jesus came primarily to live, he's an example. And then I guess we're supposed to find God by trying to be like Jesus. But if Jesus came primarily to die, he doesn't come as an example. He comes primarily as a savior. If he came as an example, he would be like every other founder of every other major religion. They all came to show you how to live and to say, that's the way to salvation, that's the way to God. But Jesus Christ comes and says, no, I'm God, come to find you. I don't come to show you how to save yourself. I come to save you and do what you should be doing. I come to live the life you should have lived, yes, but then die the death you should have died in your place. So see the centrality of his death, but then lastly, but most importantly, the modality of his death. By choosing the ceremonial jars, Jesus was signifying something he will say much more directly later on. And the book of Hebrews will say it it's in the New Testament, very directly. And that is, he came to replace all the things that the Old Testament sacrificial system, the tabernacle and the temple, the veiled Holy of Holies, the blood sacrifices, at the heart of the old system of religion was a blood sacrifice. Why? Because I am a sinner and sin needs to be punished, but something atones for my sin. Something dies in my place. And of course, over the years, there were all these animals being slaughtered. And yet, when John the Baptist saw Jesus the first time, revelation from God, he looks at him and says, behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world. And you know what he's saying? He says, all the other lambs, all the other animals, all the other things, they were just symbols of, here's the one who's going to do it. And Jesus Christ, therefore, has come to die in our place and to take our punishment. Right away, people say, that's awful. Here we are back to the primitive, bloodthirsty gods of old. Look at the Iliad. Agamemnon trying to get to Troy. He can't get there. So he sacrifices his daughter to the gods. And the gods say, oh, okay, that assuages our wrath against you, Agamemnon. Now I'll give you fair winds. And then they hear about this idea of Jesus Christ coming and dying and assuaging the wrath of God. Oh my goodness, here we have this primitive religion again. Why didn't Christianity die out with all the rest? How awful. Except the gospel is not talking about that. It's not talking about God asking one of us to sacrifice one of our children. If Jesus Christ is who he said he is, and we talked about this last night, if he's God come in the flesh, then what we have is God actually coming to earth and paying the price himself. And if you think that is just so illogical, let me appeal first to your brain, then to your emotions, and then I'll stop. First to your brain. If someone knocks over your lamp, and let's just say it's a 50-pound lamp, it costs 50 pounds to replace. They knock it over, they break it, and they say, oh, I'm so sorry. Let me repay you, let me replace it. Now you have two things you can do. You can say, yes, thank you. You can make them pay. Or you can say, oh, no, you can forgive them. But when you forgive them, you know what that means? Either you have to replace the lamp, or you have to go without. In other words, either that person pays, or you pay. But the debt doesn't go off into the air. Somebody always pays a debt. You say, well, that's monetary and that's physical. Well, think about this. If someone hurts your reputation, really, really wrongs you, what are you going to do? One of the ways you could do it, by the way, is go around to all the people who that person slandered you with and actually ruin that person's reputation. Do you know what he did? Do you know what she did? In other words, you could make them pay, or you can forgive them. And if you forgive them, you absorb that debt. You lose that face with certain people. But you don't pay them back. You don't harm them back. Don't you see? You cannot forgive without suffering. You cannot forgive a debt without taking it on yourself. God can't just look down at us and say, oh, look at you ruining each other's lives. Look at you destroying my creation. Look at you destroying each other. Look at the self-centeredness of your heart. I forgive you, though. I want you to see that God, we're made in the image of God, the Bible says, which means if we have trouble forgiving, it's because we're like him, that he can't just say, no, it's not because he doesn't want to love you. My goodness, by coming to earth in the form of Jesus Christ, God is so holy, He had to come and die and pay that debt, because that's the way it is. But he's so loving, he was glad to come and die. He's so holy, he had to. He's so loving, he was glad to. Now let me talk to you about your emotions. Is there anything offensive about the idea of substitutionary sacrifice? No, I don't think so. There is no more moving narrative. There is no more, I don't know how to say it. There's no narrative that brings more joy than to know that someone has sacrificed for you. You know, Sidney Carton, Tale of Two Cities, and Charles Darnay love the same girl, but the girl marries Charles. That's the first part of the book. But at the end of the book, Charles Darnay, because it's happening, by the way, of course, as you know, in 18th century France, Charles Darnay is arrested. He's put in the Bastille. I think the Bastille, he's in the dungeon. And he's going to be executed tomorrow. He's got a wife, he's got a child, he's going to be executed tomorrow. Sidney Carton steals into the prison. He looks a lot like Charles Darnay, so he steals into the prison, knocks Charles Darnay out, has his friends take Charles Darnay out to safety, puts on Darnay's clothes, and stays there to die in his place. At the very, very end of the book, there's a little seamstress who walks up, and she's also a prisoner, and she's going to die too. She walks up to what she thinks is Charles Darnay and starts talking to him until she realizes it's not Charles Darnay, and her eyes get really big, and she says, "Are you dying for him?" And he says, "Yes, and for his wife and child." And then she says something, this is a paraphrase, but then she basically says this. She says, "Sir, I am so frightened. I don't think I can face my own death. But if a brave, heroic man like you would hold my hand, maybe I can face it." And he says, "All right." She was moved. She was transformed by the substitutionary sacrifice of that man, and it wasn't even for her. How would you be transformed if you came to believe that Jesus Christ did it for you? That's what he came to bring. That's why he had to come to bring it. And that's how he brought it, through substitutionary sacrifice, to bring you into not just freedom from guilt, but eventually to fall into his arms at the end of time, be his spouse, love you, and perfect you. We'll say a little bit more afterwards, but that's all for right now. What we're going to do at this point is have Tom come back up and tell you, introduce someone.